Hi, and welcome to Pretty, Witty, and Gay, Queer Representation in Musical Theater. This is part 2, Out of the Closet, Musicals After 1980. So my name is Joe Slabe, and I am passionate about musical theater. I'm so passionate about it that I founded a company here in Calgary called Forte Musical Theater Guild, and we produce new Canadian musicals. So last time we talked about sort of coded references that appealed to gay audiences in the musical before 1980. But after the gay liberation movement of the 1970s, some queer musical theater creators dared to ask, why don't we just tell our own stories? Put ourselves at the center of the narrative. You know, from our slightly more privileged viewpoint, this seems like a no-brainer. If some of the greatest musical theater artists were gay, why wouldn't they put their own experiences on the stage? Well, I've worked with younger writers, and a lot of them have difficulty understanding this. And I'm super grateful that they've come of age in a world where they feel free to be completely out about who they are and not live in fear of rejection from their families, and threat of violence from gay bashers, or at the hands of the police who are supposed to be protecting them. So partially for their benefit, maybe we'll have a quick history lesson. And if you know this or lived this, my apologies. But it's good to remember just how much things have changed even in my own lifetime. So for context, when I was born, it was illegal to be gay in Canada. Until 1969, you could be thrown in jail simply for being gay. In fact, Everett Clippert, the last man to be charged under that law, wasn't released from jail until 1971. But things were looking up. Along with anti-racism and women's rights movements, gay liberation was a thing in the 1970s, and progress was being made. But until 1978, homosexuals were not allowed to immigrate to Canada. Then, in the 1980s, when I was in my teen years, AIDS swept through the gay community. And at that time, it was a death sentence. There were a lot of cruel jokes, violent homophobia, and there was even talk of putting gay people in concentration camps on the nightly news. When I started teaching in the 1990s, it was still legal to fire someone for being gay, or refuse to rent to them or serve them in your business. It wasn't until the Delwyn-Vreen decision in 1998 that sexual orientation was read into the Bill of Rights, and it became illegal to discriminate against the LGBTQ plus community. Oh, and my partner and I were already in a committed relationship for 5 years before it was even an option for us to get married in 2005. So that's some pretty big changes in my lifetime of 50 odd years. So back to musicals. There weren't really explicit depictions of gay or queer stories before the 1980s. There's a couple of little exceptions. Pre-1980, there was the Rocky Horror Show, which, I mean, some of you probably know it as a cult film, but before it was a cult film, it was a stage musical, first in 1973 in London, and then 1974 in New York. It was written by Richard O'Brien. He's a queer writer. He describes himself as being both male and female. And the show includes gender fluidity, and the main character, Dr. Frankenfurter, is a transvestite. It sort of picked up on the sexual revolution themes of the 1970s and was certainly influenced by the glam rock movement. Another early show by a writer who's going to become increasingly important as we move forward. It was a show called In Trousers. This played in New York in 1979. It's by William Finn. It's a semi-autobiographical story. It's about a married man named Marvin, who's coming to terms with his homosexuality. In the end, he decides to leave his wife and live an authentic life. Bill Finn said the show for him was ultimately about learning to write, and although it was critically panned, it laid the groundwork for his important later work that we're going to talk about soon. Because in 1980, 1980s on is sort of when we begin to see really explicitly queer stories in musicals. And the first of these is a show called March of the Falsettos in 1981. This is also by William Finn, and it's a sequel to In Trousers. And it was a one-act musical. It continued the story of Marvin on his journey of self-acceptance and finding his sort of happily ever after ending. And his extended family in the show consists of his ex-wife, Trina, his son, Jason, and his gay lover, Whizzer, and his psychiatrist, Mendel. Now, Mendel complicates matters by becoming involved with Trina, and by the end of the piece, Marvin's supposedly stable world has completely collapsed around him, but at least he knows that he's salvaged his relationship with his son, which was on very shaky ground. So this was an off-Broadway show, but it was an influential show, and it showed that there was an audience for gay and queer stories in New York. The show that really proved that not only could this be an off-Broadway phenomenon, but could actually be a mainstream success, was the show La Cage aux Folles, which was written by Jerry Herman and Harvey Fierstein. Now, there was a 1973 French play of the same name, and it tells the story of a gay couple, Georges, who manages a Saint-Tropez nightclub featuring drag entertainment, and Albin, who's his romantic partner and star attraction. And it sort of degenerates into a farce when Georges' son, Jean-Michel, brings home his fiance's ultra-conservative parents to meet them. La Cage aux Folles literally means the cage of mad woman. However, in French, folle is also a slang term for feminine homosexuals or queens. Now, when it opened on Broadway in 1983, it broke barriers for gay representation by becoming one of the first Broadway musicals centered on a homosexual relationship. And a lot of you will know the show's Act One finale, I Am What I Am, which has become a gay anthem of sorts and has been widely recorded. And the original production ran more than 4 years, over 1,700 performances. It won 6 Tony Awards, including Best Musical, Best Score, and Best Book. So unlike March of the Falsettos, which played a small off-Broadway theater, this was a high-profile, big Broadway show. Bill Finn followed up on March of the Falsettos with a second one-act show called Falsetto Lands. So it sort of follows In Trousers and March of the Falsettos as the third of a trilogy. And it's, again, centers on Marvin, his wife Trina, the psychiatrist Mendel, son Jason, gay lover Whizzer. And in this chapter of Marvin's life, Jason is preparing for his bar mitzvah, and Whizzer is suffering from a mysterious, life-threatening, as yet undefined illness, which the audience recognizes as AIDS. It forms the second act of what would eventually become a Broadway musical called Falsettos. But it's notable because it introduces the characters of Charlotte and Cordelia. They're friends of Whizzer, and they are the lesbian couple from next door. So while we're at this point, we'll talk a little bit about the influence of AIDS on the musical theater community. Obviously, it was a huge influence. New York was the center of musical theater in the English-speaking world, and many, many musical theater practitioners died early deaths because of the AIDS epidemic. And this inspired something called the AIDS Memorial Quilt. And it's relevant because it's going to inspire the creation of an important musical that I'll talk about in just a minute. The AIDS Memorial Quilt is the largest work of community art in the world. And when taken all together, it weighs an estimated 54 tons. During the 1980s, the stigma against people who died of AIDS was so great that many families just held no services. And some funeral homes would even refuse to handle the bodies of those who died of AIDS. So the idea came about that they would create a memorial for people who had died of AIDS by creating a massive quilt. And so people created quilts to commemorate the people who had died. And then these were assembled into a massive work of art, which was eventually displayed in Washington, DC. And it's very affecting. And it affected Bill Russell a lot, who wrote a show called Elegies for Angels, Punks, and Raging Queens, which played off-Broadway in 1990. And the work features songs and monologues inspired by the AIDS Memorial Quilt. So the sort of gimmick of the show is that each of the monologue is by a character who has died, and each of the songs are sung by the living and represent the feelings of friends and families dealing with the loss. I saw a production of this show at the Edinburgh Fringe, and although it sounds like it's a downer, it's actually an amazing celebration of life, and I was incredibly moved by it. I was uplifted by it, and yeah, it has humor, it has heart, and so yeah, it's worth checking out. Elegies for Angels, Punks, and Raging Queens. There's a couple of recordings that are available of it, and My Brother Lived in San Francisco is one of the songs from the show that has sort of become a bit of a staple. So well worth checking out. So in 1992, March of the Falsettos and Falsetto Land were combined into one show, a full-length musical that played Broadway in 1992. It was nominated for 7 Tony Awards, and it won 2 for Best Book and Best Score. Alberta Theatre Projects did a show here in 1999, and I saw it, and the audience reaction was interesting. It seemed like the straight audience was ready to engage with the eccentric characters and really liked the humor of the first act, but it's almost like the temperature in the theater went down in the second act when people were reminded of the AIDS health crisis, and it almost felt like perhaps they disengaged. Maybe they felt it wasn't their problem. It was an interesting experience for me as a gay man to watch this story in a theater filled with mostly straight people, and feel what I thought was a cool reaction once the topic of AIDS came up. After Falsettos premiered in Broadway in 1992, in 1993, John Kender and Fred Ebb wrote a musical based on a movie called Kiss of the Spider-Woman with a script by Terrence McNally. This musical tells the story of Molina, a gay window dresser in Argentina who's been jailed for corrupting a minor, and his revolutionary cellmate, Valentin. Molina cares for Valentin after he's been tortured and distracts him by recounting scenes from movies featuring his favorite diva, Aurora. And her most haunting role is that of the Spider-Woman who kills with her kiss. The cellmates gradually become closer, but Molina dies tragically trying to help Valentin. Even though the show was nominated for 11 Tonys and won 7, including Best Musical, I don't love Kiss of the Spider-Woman. I don't know, something about the gay guy sacrificing himself for the straight dude didn't sit well with me. There's a trope that the gay character has to die at the end. And to me, it sends the message that gays are sad and doomed. And I think audiences might have also felt that the story was played out a bit, and it wasn't a huge hit the way that La Cage was. Now, I debated including this next musical as a gay show, because the next sort of big high-profile show, and it was hugely high-profile, was Rent in 1996. I wasn't sure to include it because Jonathan Larson was straight. He did tragically die of an aortic aneurysm before the show opened, and it certainly reflects Larson's life living in New York. He portrays life in his East Village neighborhood. It's set against the backdrop of AIDS. It features bisexual and gay characters like Maureen, Joanne, and Tom, as well as the trans character Angel, which also might have been a first. But my beef a little bit is that these characters serve as subplot and as comic relief to the central heterosexual romance. So while it was certainly influential, I'm not sure it centered those stories the way that I would have liked them to have been. But then it's not my show. In 1998, William Finn wrote another show that I feel was a little bit of a breakthrough. It was called A New Brain. And it was written in response to a serious health incident that landed Finn in the hospital with a problem with the blood supply to his brain. There are a few things that I liked about it. It wasn't a huge hit, but it was the first time that I saw Kristen Chenoweth in a show. And she went on to, of course, be one of the great divas of musical theater. And the other thing that I liked about the show is that the character's gayness was just a fact. It wasn't an issue. The central character had a boyfriend who loved him. He had supportive family and friends. And the fact that he was gay was just the fact. And it wasn't commented on or made an issue. So progress. Also in 1998, a show played off-Broadway called Hedwig and the Angry Inch. This was created by the gay writers Stephen Trask and John Cameron Mitchell. And John Cameron Mitchell also starred in the show. It's the first show featuring a genderqueer trans character. It's been performed exclusively all over the world. It was made into a film. And then it played off-Broadway in 1998, but it went on to a Broadway production in 2014, where it won 4 Tony Awards, including Best Revival of the Musical. So that brings us to the new millennium, into the 2000s. So in 2003, there was a show came out called Taboo. This show featured lyrics by Boy George, and it's centered around the regulars of the club Taboo. That was from the title. It was critically panned, and it closed after 100 performances. Rosie O'Donnell was a famous backer of it. She still claims she's going to bring it back, but people just didn't care. So not everything we write can be successful. And in the same year, 2003, there's another off-Broadway show that you might not be aware of, but that I thought I would mention. It's called A Man of No Importance. This show is by the gay composer Stephen Flaherty, who wrote it with his writing partner, Lynn Ahrens, with a book by Terrence McNally. Terrence McNally writes a lot of musical theater books and plays as well. He's got to be one of the busiest writers in the world. But this is based on the 1994 film with Albert Finney about an Irish amateur dramatics group putting on a production of Salome at the local church, despite the objections of the church authorities. Alfie Byrne is the amateur director of the play. He's a bus conductor by day, and he is the man of no importance in the title. It's the story of Alfie's journey to self-acceptance and how eventually his community of players supports him in spite of the prejudice from some of his conservative Catholic community. And it's a lovely little show. So if it's not on your radar, it's worth checking out. So I'm going to insert, because we're up to 2003, I'm going to insert myself in the narrative, because now we come to 2005, which is when I was doing my master's degree in musical theater composition in London, England. And I was working on a show called Jeremy de Bergerac. I wanted to write a show, a gay coming of age story. And so I completed Act 1 as I was working on this. And I based it on Cyrano de Bergerac, which is, if you don't know it, it's romantic, it's funny, it's tragic, there's sword fighting. And I just love the way that Rostand balanced all these elements of the show. And so I wanted to write a musical that reflected that. And it was a love triangle of boy loves girl, girl loves other boy, that boy loves the first boy. And I completed it as the first act as part of my master's degree, because I wasn't seeing those kind of stories and wanted to do that. But then I got sidetracked with another show that I was working on, which basically took up the next 5 years of my life working on. So I needed to abandon that. But while I was working on the other show, Ostentatious, I got to know a show called Title of Show, which was by 2 gay writers, Hunter Bell and Jeff Bowen. And if you don't know Title of Show, it's a musical about 2 guys writing a musical about 2 guys writing a musical. It debuted at the New York Musical Theater Festival, and it was an instant hit. It went on to an off-Broadway run in 2006. It eventually made it to Broadway in 2008. And what I love about the show is that the characters are gay and that it's just never an issue. They have a dream of being on Broadway, and the show actually chronicles its own story of how it got there. It's like a Mickey and Judy story for our time, except Mickey and Judy are 2 musical theater loving gay dudes named Hunter and Jeff. And I was really excited to do the Calgary premiere of the show. I produced it, in 2011. So I was very excited about that. And it's a super fun, funny show that is worth a look. In 2008, a lot of you will have heard of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. This based on the movie, a pretty famous movie, and it was originally done in Sydney and based on the 90s film of the same name. It tells us the story of two drag queens and a trans woman. They're hired to perform a drag show in Alice Springs. The show eventually came to Broadway in 2011. It featured spectacular costumes, dazzling drag numbers, and was a big hit. So again, a queer story that had resonance for a mass audience, which is great. Around about 2012, I finally got around to finishing that show that I started back in 2005. Remember Jeremy de Bergerac? Well, we did it here, and then eventually I took it to the New York Musical Festival in 2013 under a change title. It's called Crossing Swords. And that was my gay coming of age story. It was set in Canada in the late 1960s, right at the time that Trudeau decriminalized homosexual behavior. And yeah, it's not a big political story. It's basically a romantic comedy set in the late 1960s in Canada. And it's available to stream on all of your platforms. We did a cast recording here in Calgary, and I'm quite proud of it. So yes, a little local coming of age gay story for you to check out called Crossing Swords. Also in 2013, when I was at the festival, a show came out called Kinky Boots. Now, again, I'm not sure how gay this show is, but it does feature a major character who's a drag queen. I have a slight beef with it because, of course, the drag queen exists to basically support the straight male central character. But there's no denying that it was a big hit and very popular with audiences. One of my favorite shows of the last few years is a show that came out in 2015, and it's called Fun Home. The lyrics and book are by the lesbian writer Lisa Krohn, and it's based on a graphic novel by Alison Bechdel. For those of you who might not know Alison Bechdel as a graphic novelist or cartoonist, you might know her, recognize her name because she popularized something called the Bechdel test. This is a test for women's representation in fiction. And it just asks some very simple stories. It asks some very simple questions. First off, are there at least two women in the story? Do they have names? Do they talk to each other? And do they talk about something other than a man? Now, this seems like a pretty low bar, but you'd be amazed at the number of shows that do not pass the Bechdel test. The entire Lord of the Rings trilogy does not pass the Bechdel test. The Avengers does not pass the Bechdel test. Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows does not pass the Bechdel test. And La La Land doesn't pass the Bechdel test either. Being aware of this test has informed my own writing, because I make very sure that if I have two female characters in a show, that definitely they need to have names, talk to each other, and talk about something other than a man. But anyway, back to Fun Home. Fun Home is the first Broadway show with a lesbian protagonist. Allison, the Alison Bechdel character, struggles to understand her own sexual identity while confronting her father's secret identity as a gay man. And the show contrasts what can happen when we accept who we are as opposed to hide who we are. In one case, Allison's story ends happily, and her father's decidedly does not. One of the interesting things about the show is that it features three Allisons at different ages. And young Allison's performance of Ring of Keys on the Tony Awards broadcast was simply incredible. And it's on YouTube, so you should definitely check that out. That night, the show won 5 Tonys, including Best Musical, Best Book, and Best Score. And it kind of, at that time, I was feeling a little disillusioned about the future of the Broadway musical in particular. And the fact that it was so highly awarded and embraced by audiences really gave me hope for the future. And since then, there's been other shows recently. In 2017, there was a show called Everybody's Talking About Jamie in the West End about a 16-year-old drag queen. And in 2018, there was a show called The Prom, which became Netflix movie about a troupe of washed up Broadway performers who fight for a lesbian to be allowed to take her girlfriend to a prom in small town America. And even in the pre-pandemic days, just before, in January of 2020, Theatre Calgary did a show called The Louder We Get, that I was very fortunate to be mentored in musical direction by the musical director on that show. And that told the true life story of Mark Hall, who fought to be allowed to take his male date to the prom in Ontario. And Mark Hall actually lives in Calgary these days. So these stories are out there. They're there for you. And I hope that you have sort of enjoyed this look back at where we came from and where we've got to, and in some ways, where we've still got some distance to go. But I'm Joe Slabe. I hope that you enjoyed this, and thanks for listening.